At the Christmas party, my wife snapped, "I'm not your property." I leaned in and whispered, "Good, because you're not my anything anymore." Her smile vanished in front of everyone. What should have been a celebration of my recent promotion to senior software architect at Dataflow Solutions turned into the most humiliating night of my 15-year marriage to Rebecca. I had been looking forward to introducing her to my new supervisor, Linda Martinez, who had specifically asked to meet the woman behind the supportive husband who'd been putting in 60-hour weeks on the Morrison account. Rebecca arrived an hour late with 3 women I'd never seen before, all wearing matching, nevertheless she persisted, pins and carrying themselves like they were about to storm the Bastille. She'd been attending what she called consciousness-raising workshops for 8 months, but I hadn't expected her to turn our company's holiday celebration into her personal political rally. The moment I approached with Linda, Rebecca's expression shifted into something I barely recognized. "Daniel," she announced loudly enough for half the room to hear, "I hope you're not planning to parade me around like some trophy wife to impress your corporate overlords." Linda's eyebrows shot up as several conversations around us stopped mid-sentence. "Rebecca, I'd like you to meet Linda Martinez, my new supervisor," I said quietly, hoping to salvage the situation. "Linda, this is my wife Rebecca." But Rebecca was already in full performance mode for her audience of 3. "Oh, how convenient," she said, her voice dripping with theatrical disdain. "The patriarchal power structure wants to inspect the little woman and make sure she's appropriately grateful for her husband's success." I watched Linda's professional smile freeze in place as she tried to process what was happening. "I was actually looking forward to meeting you," Linda said carefully. "Daniel speaks about you often, and I wanted to thank you for supporting him during the Morrison project crunch time." That's when Rebecca completely lost it. "Support him?" she laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You mean enable his participation in a system designed to exploit workers while concentrating wealth among corporate elites?" The entire party seemed to pause as Rebecca's voice carried across the room. My colleagues from the development team turned to stare, drinks halfway to their mouths. Even the catering staff stopped moving. "I'm not his property to be shown off at company functions," Rebecca continued, her voice rising to near shouting levels. "I'm not some accessory to validate his professional achievements or make small talk about how proud I am of his capitalist contributions." Linda took a small step backward, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of Rebecca's outburst. "I didn't mean to imply anything inappropriate," she said diplomatically. "I simply wanted to meet you as Daniel's partner." "Partner?" Rebecca's voice cracked with indignation. "We're not partners in anything anymore. Partnership implies equality, and there's no equality in a marriage where one person sacrifices their identity to support the other's career advancement." The room had gone completely silent now. I could see Tom Bradley from accounting discreetly recording with his phone while his wife Sarah shook her head in disbelief. Even the bartender had stopped pouring drinks to watch the spectacle unfold. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest as I realized this wasn't just another one of Rebecca's political phases. This was her publicly destroying our marriage in front of everyone I worked with, using language design to make me look like some kind of oppressive monster. "Rebecca," I said quietly, trying one last time to de-escalate, "maybe we should continue this conversation at home." "No," she snapped, turning to face me fully. "I'm done having conversations in private where you can manipulate and gaslight me into compliance. These women," she gestured to her 3 companions who were nodding encouragingly, "have helped me understand that my silence has been complicity in my own oppression." That's when she grabbed her wine glass and threw it down on the marble floor, the sound of shattering crystal cutting through the stunned silence like a gunshot. Red wine splashed across my dress shoes and onto Linda's cream-colored dress. The dramatic gesture was clearly intended to punctuate her declaration of independence, but instead it just looked unhinged and desperate. I stared at the broken glass, at the wine staining the expensive venue floor, at my wife's flushed face twisted with righteous fury, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. 15 years of marriage, of building a life together, of supporting each other through career changes and family deaths and financial struggles, and she was throwing it all away for applause from 3 strangers who'd convinced her that loving her husband made her a victim. I leaned in close, my voice barely above a whisper, and said the words that would end our marriage right there in front of 43 witnesses. Good. Because you're not my anything anymore. The triumphant expression on Rebecca's face crumbled instantly. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to process what I'd just said, but no words came out. The three women behind her stopped nodding and started looking uncomfortable as they realized their empowerment session had just cost someone their marriage. Linda cleared her throat and quietly excused herself, stepping carefully around the broken glass. Other guests began moving away from our little circle of destruction, some heading for the bar, others gathering their coats. The party was effectively over, and everyone knew it. Rebecca stood there in the spreading silence, wine staining the hem of her black dress, surrounded by the wreckage of what she'd just destroyed, finally understanding that some bridges can't be rebuilt once you've burned them down in front of everyone who matters. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, though looking back I should have seen the warning signs much earlier than I did. 8 months before the Christmas party disaster, Rebecca had enrolled in what she called a women's liberation workshop at Sacramento Community College, taught by Dr. Patricia Winters, a divorced women's studies professor who seemed to view every marriage as a prison sentence waiting to be commuted. What started as Rebecca wanting to explore her identity quickly became an obsession with dismantling everything we'd built together over 15 years of marriage. I remember the first real red flag was when she came home from her second workshop session and announced that our traditional division of household responsibilities was perpetuating patriarchal oppression. This from the woman who had specifically asked to handle our finances and meal planning because she enjoyed the organizational aspects and I was hopeless with grocery budgets. I've been thinking about how I've been unconsciously supporting systems of male dominance, she said over dinner that Tuesday night in March, using the clinical tone she'd adopted whenever discussing her newfound enlightenment. The way I've been managing our household expenses while you focus on your career advancement creates an unequal power dynamic that reinforces traditional gender roles. I looked up from my pasta, genuinely confused. Rebecca, you literally told me last month that you preferred handling the budget because I once bought 3 boxes of the same cereal by accident. That's exactly my point, she said, her voice taking on that lecturing quality I was starting to dread. I've been conditioned to take responsibility for domestic management while you get to focus on professional growth and financial achievement. It's a classic pattern of internalized misogyny. The woman sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the Rebecca who used to laugh at my terrible jokes and actually seemed proud when I got promoted to senior developer 2 years earlier. This new version analyzed every interaction through a lens of oppression and power structures, turning casual conversations into ideological battlegrounds. By month 3, she'd started bringing her workshop friends to our house for what she called consciousness-raising circles. The core group consisted of Dr. Winters, a bitter activist named Janet Kozlov who'd been through 4 divorces, and 2 younger women in their 20s who treated Rebecca like some kind of mentor figure. They'd sit in our living room drinking wine and discussing the emotional labor burden of maintaining relationships with men who couldn't be bothered to examine their privilege. I tried to be supportive, even bought coffee and snacks for their meetings, but it became increasingly clear that their primary bonding activity involved cataloging everything wrong with their relationships and encouraging each other to demand radical changes from their partners. Daniel's been very accommodating, Rebecca would say during these sessions, like I was some kind of domesticated animal she was training. He's agreed to split household chores 50-50 and gives me complete autonomy over my schedule and social activities. That's the bare minimum, Janet would respond predictably. The fact that you're grateful for basic human decency shows how low your expectations have been programmed to be. These conversations always ended with Rebecca looking vaguely dissatisfied with our marriage, like she was missing out on some greater level of fulfillment that I was selfishly denying her. The breaking point with my family came during Easter dinner at my mother's house, when Rebecca decided to turn our traditional family gathering into a lecture about gender roles and societal expectations. My 72-year-old mother had spent the entire day preparing Rebecca's favorite dishes, including a homemade carrot cake that took her 3 hours to make from scratch. Instead of thanking her, Rebecca launched into a critique of how women like my mother had internalized oppression by defining their worth through domestic service to male family members. Mom, Rebecca said, her voice carrying that patronizing tone she'd perfected in her workshops, I need you to understand that when you spend entire days cooking elaborate meals for family gatherings, you're perpetuating harmful stereotypes about women's roles and enabling the men in this family to avoid taking equal responsibility for emotional and domestic labor. My mother, who had raised 3 children as a single parent after my father died and worked double shifts as a nurse to keep us fed and clothed, just stared at Rebecca with the kind of hurt confusion that made my chest tighten with anger. I cook these meals because I love my family, she said quietly. It brings me joy to see everyone enjoying food I made with care. That's exactly the problem, Rebecca continued, oblivious to the pain she was causing. You've been conditioned to find fulfillment in serving others instead of pursuing your own goals and desires. It's a form of self-sacrifice that reinforces patriarchal structures by making women responsible for everyone else's emotional well-being. My brother Mike started to stand up, his face flushed with anger, but I caught his eye and shook my head slightly. Getting into a shouting match with Rebecca would only validate her victim narrative. Instead, I simply said, "Rebecca, I think we should probably head home now," and guided her toward the door while she continued explaining to my devastated mother why traditional family dynamics were harmful to women's liberation. The drive home was silent except for Rebecca's occasional commentary about how my family's resistance to examining their privilege demonstrated the depth of their indoctrination into oppressive systems. I realized in that moment that the woman I'd married, the one who used to help my mother in the kitchen and genuinely enjoyed our family traditions, had been replaced by someone who viewed every act of love and care through a lens of political oppression. By month 6, Rebecca had quit her part-time marketing job because her male supervisor had mansplained a project deadline to her, and she refused to participate in what she called capitalist exploitation disguised as professional development. She started spending her days reading radical feminist literature and attending additional workshops on deconstructing internalized patriarchy and reclaiming feminine power. Our savings account began shrinking as I covered all the household expenses alone while Rebecca pursued her journey of self-discovery. When I gently suggested that she might want to consider finding another job, she accused me of trying to control her choices and force her back into wage slavery to support my bourgeois lifestyle expectations. The final straw came when she started targeting our 15-year-old daughter Emma with her newfound ideology, suggesting that Emma's interest in fashion and makeup was evidence of internalized misogyny, and that her close relationship with me represented daddy issues that needed to be addressed through feminist therapy. Emma started spending more time at friends' houses to avoid her mother's constant lectures about rejecting traditional femininity and questioning male authority figures. The transformation was complete by the time we reached the Christmas party, 8 months after that first workshop session, and I was married to a stranger who viewed our 15-year relationship as evidence of my oppressive nature rather than the partnership we'd built together through love, compromise, and mutual support. What Rebecca didn't know as she stood there in her wine-stained dress, watching our marriage implode in front of my entire office, was that I'd been quietly preparing for this moment for almost 2 months. The Easter dinner incident with my mother had been my wake-up call, but it was Rebecca's attempt to turn our daughter against me that finally convinced me to take action. I'd spent weeks researching divorce attorneys before settling on Margaret Chin, a no-nonsense family lawyer who specialized in high-conflict separations and had a reputation for protecting fathers' rights when dealing with unstable spouses. Our first meeting had been scheduled during my lunch break on a Tuesday in October, in her downtown Sacramento office that smelled like leather and coffee. "I need you to document everything," Margaret had told me after I explained Rebecca's transformation and increasingly erratic behavior. Audio recordings of her verbal attacks, screenshots of her social media posts, witness statements from family members who've seen her behavior firsthand. If this ends up in court, we want to demonstrate a clear pattern of instability. Following Margaret's advice, I'd started carrying my phone with voice recording activated whenever Rebecca launched into one of her political lectures or personal attacks. The audio files were devastating. Rebecca calling me a patriarchal oppressor who was psychologically abusing her by expecting basic partnership responsibilities, her telling Emma that I represented toxic masculinity that needed to be rejected, her screaming at my mother over the phone about enabling misogynistic family structures. I'd also been quietly reorganizing our finances, transferring my direct deposit to a new account at a different bank, and calculating exactly how our shared assets would need to be divided. The house, which we'd bought 7 years ago, had appreciated significantly, but Rebecca's name wasn't on the mortgage since her credit had been damaged by student loans from her abandoned master's program. Her legal claim to the property would be limited to whatever equity had accumulated during our marriage. Margaret had helped me secure a furnished one-bedroom apartment 3 miles away, close enough that Emma could easily visit but far enough to establish clear boundaries. I'd been moving my essential belongings there gradually over 6 weeks, one box at a time, storing everything in the spare closet until I was ready to make my final exit. The lease was already signed, utilities connected, and I'd even stocked the refrigerator with Emma's favorite foods for when she inevitably needed a refuge from her mother's constant ideological bombardment. When Rebecca finally came home from the Christmas party, her 3 workshop companions conspicuously absent, she found me in our bedroom calmly folding clothes into the pre-packed moving boxes I'd retrieved from the apartment earlier that evening. Her face was still flushed from the wine and public humiliation, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, but she walked in with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed she'd won some kind of victory. "I hope you're satisfied," she said, standing in the doorway like she was addressing a hostile audience. "You made me look completely unstable in front of your entire office because you couldn't handle me speaking truth to power about our dysfunctional relationship dynamic." I continued folding my shirts methodically, not bothering to look up from the systematic process I'd planned and rehearsed. "Rebecca, there's an envelope on your nightstand with some documents you'll need to review." She glanced over at the manila envelope, then back at me with growing suspicion. "What kind of documents?" "Divorce papers," I said simply, placing another shirt in the box. "Your copy of the asset division calculations, and information about refinancing the house in your name only if you want to keep it." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the heating system kick on, the distant sound of our neighbor's dog barking, the clock on the nightstand marking seconds that felt like minutes. When I finally looked up, Rebecca's face had gone completely white except for 2 bright spots of color high on her cheekbones. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice losing all of its earlier bravado. "You filed for divorce because I stood up for myself at one company party?" "I filed for divorce because you've spent 8 months systematically destroying our marriage, alienating our daughter, and treating everyone who loves you like they're personally responsible for oppressing women throughout history." I sealed the box I'd been packing and wrote, "Daniel Clothes" on the side with a black marker. The Christmas party was just the final public demonstration of what you've become. She moved closer to the bed, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up the envelope. "Daniel, I know I've been going through some changes, but marriage is about supporting each other through personal growth and transformation. You can't just abandon 15 years because I'm discovering my authentic self." "Your authentic self threw a wine glass on the floor in front of my boss and called our marriage a patriarchal oppression scheme," I replied, moving to the dresser to pack my remaining socks and underwear. "Your authentic self told my 72-year-old mother that cooking dinner for her family made her a victim of internalized misogyny. Your authentic self has been trying to convince our 15-year-old daughter that having a good relationship with her father is evidence of psychological damage." Rebecca tore open the envelope with jerky, desperate movements and pulled out the legal documents. Her eyes scanned the pages rapidly, her face growing paler with each paragraph. "You've been planning this," she said, her voice hollow with realization. "The asset division, the custody arrangement, the timeline for selling the house. You've been 3 steps ahead this entire time while I thought we were just going through a rough patch." "We weren't going through a rough patch, Rebecca. You were systematically dismantling our family while I tried to figure out if there was anything left of the woman I married." I closed the dresser drawers and picked up the box I'd just packed. "Margaret Chen will handle all communication from this point forward. Her contact information is in the paperwork." "Margaret Chen?" Rebecca's voice cracked with panic. "You hired Margaret Chen? She's the lawyer who destroyed Tom Peterson's ex-wife in their custody battle. Everyone knows she's ruthless." "She's thorough," I corrected, heading toward the bedroom door. And she specializes in protecting people from partners who've become unstable and vindictive during divorce proceedings. Rebecca followed me down the hallway, the legal documents clutched in her hands like evidence of some terrible betrayal. Daniel, please. I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling. I can dial back some of the workshop stuff if it's causing problems. Rebecca, yesterday you told 43 people that our marriage was a prison sentence and that I was your oppressor. Today you want to go to counseling. I set the box by the front door next to the 3 others I'd already packed. The time for working through things was 6 months ago, before you decided that loving your family was a form of false consciousness. I never said loving my family was false consciousness, she protested weakly. You said supporting my career made you complicit in capitalist exploitation. You said cooking dinner together was perpetuating gender stereotypes. You said our daughter's affection for me was evidence of daddy issues that needed feminist therapy. I picked up my keys from the hall table, the same table where Rebecca used to leave little notes in my lunch bag before her consciousness got raised. You turned everything good in our lives into evidence of oppression, and now you're surprised that there's nothing left to save. The real heartbreak wasn't losing Rebecca, it was watching what her transformation had done to our 15-year-old daughter Emma. 3 days after I moved into my new apartment, Emma showed up at my door after school with red eyes and a backpack stuffed with enough clothes for a week. She'd been trying to stay neutral in what she called Mom's weird phase, but Rebecca had finally pushed too far. Dad, I can't live with her anymore, Emma said, collapsing onto my couch with the exhausted expression of someone much older than 15. She's completely lost it. Yesterday, she spent 2 hours explaining why my friendship with Tyler Martinez is problematic because I'm seeking male validation instead of developing authentic female relationships. Tyler Martinez was Emma's study partner in AP History, a quiet kid whose biggest crime was helping her understand the Treaty of Versailles and occasionally making her laugh during lunch. The idea that their innocent friendship represented some kind of psychological dysfunction was exactly the kind of ideological overreach that had been poisoning our household for months. What else has she been saying to you? I asked carefully, not wanting to influence Emma's perceptions but needing to understand the full scope of Rebecca's impact on our daughter. Emma pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages that made my stomach clench with anger. Screenshots of conversations where Rebecca had called me a patriarchal oppressor, suggested that Emma's good grades were evidence of performing for male authority figures, and recommended that Emma start seeing a feminist therapist to work through her daddy issues. The most disturbing message was from just 2 days earlier. Emma, I need you to understand that your father represents everything that's wrong with traditional masculinity. His career success has come at the expense of my personal growth and self-actualization. The fact that you admire him shows how deeply you've internalized misogynistic values that prioritize male achievement over female empowerment. She actually sent you that? I asked, trying to keep my voice level despite the fury building in my chest. That's just from this week, Emma said, scrolling through months of similar messages. She's been getting worse since the Christmas party thing. Now she says the divorce is actually liberating for both of us because we can finally escape your toxic influence and develop authentic relationships with other women. I read through more of the messages, each one more disturbing than the last. Rebecca had been systematically trying to alienate Emma from me, using the language and concepts she'd learned in her workshops to reframe our close father-daughter relationship as evidence of psychological damage rather than genuine love and connection. Dad, she wants me to change my last name, Emma said quietly. She says keeping Morrison instead of switching to her maiden name shows that I'm still psychologically owned by the patriarchal family structure. The casual cruelty of that suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Emma had been proud of sharing my name since she was old enough to write it in crayon on school assignments. The idea that Rebecca would try to sever even that connection showed how completely her ideology had consumed her maternal instincts. She also enrolled me in Dr. Winter's teenage empowerment workshop without asking, Emma continued. I went to one session and it was basically just a group of angry women telling teenage girls that their relationships with their fathers were preventing them from developing healthy self-esteem. I had to take several deep breaths before I could respond without losing control completely. Emma, you don't have to go to any workshops you don't want to attend. And you certainly don't have to change your name or question your relationship with me because your mother's going through an ideological phase. Is that what this is? Emma asked hopefully. A phase? Because sometimes I think she's actually lost her mind. Last week she threw away all my makeup and told me that wearing mascara was participating in the objectification of women for male consumption. Then she bought me these awful shapeless clothes that look like potato sacks because anything fitted is supposedly designed to emphasize body parts that attract male attention. The transformation of my confident, happy daughter into this anxious, confused teenager was perhaps the most unforgivable aspect of Rebecca's radical awakening. Emma had always been secure in herself, comfortable with both her academic achievements and her normal teenage interests in fashion and social activities. Rebecca's constant analysis and criticism had turned every aspect of Emma's identity into a potential source of shame or political incorrectness. "Dad, can I stay here?" Emma asked, her voice small and vulnerable in a way that broke my heart. "I know you and Mom are getting divorced and I'm supposed to stay neutral, but I can't handle living with someone who thinks everything about me needs to be deconstructed and corrected." "Of course you can stay here," I said immediately. "This is your home too, for as long as you want it to be." Emma started crying then, the kind of relieved tears that come after months of holding in frustration and confusion. "I just want my mom back," she said. "The one who used to help me pick out clothes for school dances and actually seemed proud of my grades instead of analyzing them for evidence of internalized depression." I held my daughter while she cried for the mother she'd lost to radical ideology, and I realized that Rebecca's workshops hadn't just destroyed our marriage. They'd cost her the relationship with the daughter who had adored her, replacing maternal love with political indoctrination so toxic that a 15-year-old girl felt safer living with her divorced father than remaining in her childhood home. The irony was devastating. In her quest to liberate herself from patriarchal oppression, Rebecca had become the kind of controlling, manipulative parent that actually damages children's psychological development. When Emma finally calmed down, she showed me the group text chain she'd been ignoring from her mother's workshop friends, all of them offering to mentor her through the difficult process of rejecting male-centered family dynamics and help her develop authentic female relationships away from my toxic influence. These women, who barely knew Emma and had never witnessed our actual family interactions, felt qualified to counsel a teenager about rejecting her father based purely on ideological assumptions about gender and power. "I blocked all of them," Emma said. "And I told Mom that if she keeps trying to turn me against you, I'm going to ask the court to let me live with you permanently." The fact that my 15-year-old daughter had to threaten legal action to protect our relationship from her mother's ideological crusade was a new low in an already devastating situation. But I was proud of Emma's strength and clarity, her ability to see through the manipulation and choose love over ideology. Rebecca's response to Emma's decision to live with me was exactly what I expected. She blamed me for brainwashing our daughter against feminist ideals and using parental alienation tactics to win custody. The woman who had spent months trying to convince Emma that her father represented everything wrong with masculinity was now accusing me of manipulating our daughter's perceptions. The community fallout from the Christmas party incident was swift and more devastating than I could have imagined. Tom Bradley, the accounting colleague who had discreetly recorded Rebecca's meltdown, initially kept the video private, but when Rebecca started posting on social media about my abusive and controlling behavior, he felt compelled to share the actual footage with our mutual friends. The video went viral within our local community network, racking up over 50,000 views as people shared it with commentary like, "This is what radical feminism actually looks like," and "Poor guy, his wife completely lost it at a work party." What made the video particularly damaging for Rebecca was the stark contrast between her claims of being a victim and the actual footage of her screaming about patriarchal oppression while throwing wine glasses in front of shocked colleagues who were just trying to enjoy a holiday celebration. You could see my supervisor Linda Martinez's genuine confusion and concern, my calm attempts to de-escalate the situation, and Rebecca's increasingly unhinged performance for her 3 workshop companions who were clearly encouraging the confrontation. Within days, I was getting calls from coworkers I barely knew, sharing their own stories about Rebecca's recent behavior at company events I'd missed. Sarah Kim from HR told me that Rebecca had cornered 3 female employees at the summer picnic, lecturing them about internalized misogyny for wearing makeup and performing femininity for male approval. Jennifer Walsh from marketing described a disturbing encounter where Rebecca had criticized her engagement ring as a symbol of patriarchal ownership and suggested she reconsider marriage entirely since it was an inherently oppressive institution designed to control women's sexuality and labor. Even more concerning were the stories from our daughter's school community. Emma's friend Madison Peterson's mother called to apologize for avoiding our family events, explaining that Rebecca had made several parents uncomfortable with aggressive political discussions during school fundraisers. She told me that volunteering for the PDA was perpetuating gender stereotypes and that I should be focusing on my career instead of supporting educational institutions that reinforce traditional power structures, Lisa Peterson explained. I just wanted to help organize the fall carnival, not get a lecture about feminist theory. The most heartbreaking call came from my own mother, who had been dealing with months of harassment from Rebecca since the Easter dinner incident. Daniel, she's been sending me articles about internalized misogyny and leaving voicemails about how I need to examine my role in perpetuating patriarchal family dynamics, my mother said, her voice shaky with hurt and confusion. Yesterday she showed up at my house with those women from her group, wanting to have an intervention about my relationship with my sons. The image of my 72-year-old mother being ambushed in her own home by Rebecca and her radical feminist crew for the crime of loving her children was almost too much to bear. My mother had worked double nursing shifts to raise 3 boys alone after my father died, and the suggestion that her sacrifices and love somehow represented oppressive behavior was both cruel and absurd. But the most satisfying aspect of the community response was watching Rebecca's own workshop friends gradually distance themselves from her as the negative publicity grew. Dr. Patricia Winters quietly asked Rebecca to stop attending the consciousness-raising sessions after other participants complained about her increasingly volatile outbursts and tendency to dominate discussions with personal grievances against her family. Janet Kozlov, the bitter activist who had initially encouraged Rebecca's transformation, stopped returning her calls when the viral video made their entire group look like unhinged extremists who destroyed stable families for ideological points. Even the 2 younger women who had treated Rebecca like a mentor figure began avoiding her, apparently deciding that association with someone who had become a cautionary tale about radical feminism gone wrong wasn't good for their own social reputations. The community college administration received enough complaints about the Women's Liberation Workshop that they quietly suspended the program, citing concerns about the instructor's methods and the negative impact on participants' family relationships. Dr. Winters was reassigned to teaching basic composition courses, effectively ending her career as a radical feminist educator who specialized in convincing married women that their loving relationships were actually forms of psychological oppression. Rebecca's isolation was complete within 6 weeks of the Christmas party incident. The viral video had made her unemployable in our professional community, her workshop friends had abandoned her, and even her own extended family began reaching out to me with apologies and expressions of concern about her mental state. Her sister Jennifer called from Portland to ask if Rebecca was having some kind of breakdown, explaining that Rebecca had been sending long, rambling emails about liberation from patriarchal family structures and suggesting that Jennifer's happy marriage was evidence of internalized depression. She's trying to convince me to leave my husband because he earns more money than I do, Jennifer said incredulously. She says our income disparity proves that I'm being financially controlled and exploited. David and I have been happily married for 12 years. We split responsibilities based on what works for our family, not according to some ideological checklist. The community response validated everything I'd been experiencing privately for 8 months. Rebecca's behavior wasn't just affecting our marriage, it was alienating everyone who cared about her, isolating her from the very support networks that might have helped her find a healthier path forward. Her radical awakening had become a form of social suicide, burning bridges with family, friends, and community members who had committed no crime beyond living normal, loving lives that didn't conform to her newly acquired political framework. The divorce proceedings were a masterclass in how documented evidence and professional legal representation can protect you from a vindictive ex-spouse who's lost touch with reality. Margaret Chen had prepared meticulously, organizing months of audio recordings, text message screenshots, witness statements, and the viral Christmas party video into a comprehensive case that painted Rebecca as mentally unstable and potentially harmful to our daughter's well-being. Rebecca's decision to represent herself in court proved to be a catastrophic mistake that accelerated her legal defeat beyond my wildest expectations. She walked into the Sacramento County Family Court wearing a "Nevertheless She Persisted" t-shirt and carrying a folder of feminist theory articles that she apparently believed would convince Judge Patricia Hendricks that our marriage had been an exercise in systematic oppression. "Your Honor," Rebecca began during her opening statement, "this divorce represents my liberation from a relationship that exemplified everything wrong with patriarchal marriage structures. My husband used financial control and emotional manipulation to suppress my authentic self-expression and feminist consciousness." Judge Hendricks, a 58-year-old woman with 30 years of family court experience, listened patiently while Rebecca launched into a 15-minute lecture about gender roles, power dynamics, and the ways that traditional marriage perpetuates women's oppression. The judge's expression grew increasingly skeptical as Rebecca cited academic papers instead of addressing the actual legal issues of asset division and custody arrangements. Margaret's cross-examination was surgical in its precision and devastating in its effectiveness. She played selected audio recordings of Rebecca's verbal attacks, including the particularly damning conversation where Rebecca had told Emma that her relationship with me was evidence of daddy issues that needed feminist therapy to resolve. "Mrs. Morrison," Margaret said, "in this recording from November 15th, we can hear you telling your 15-year-old daughter that her father represents toxic masculinity and that she should consider changing her last name to distance herself from patriarchal family structures. Can you explain how this benefits your child's emotional development?" Rebecca's face flushed red as her own voice filled the courtroom, the words sounding even more cruel and manipulative in the formal legal setting than they had in our living room. "I was trying to help Emma develop critical thinking about gender roles and societal expectations," she said defensively. "Children need to understand how patriarchal systems shape their perceptions of normal family dynamics." Margaret then presented the text messages Rebecca had sent to Emma, projecting them on a screen where everyone could see Rebecca calling me a patriarchal oppressor, and suggesting that Emma's good grades were evidence of performing for male authority figures. Judge Hendricks studied the messages with the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen enough parental alienation cases to recognize the psychological damage being inflicted on a child. "Mrs. Morrison," the judge said carefully, "these communications with your daughter appear to be attempts to undermine her relationship with her father using ideological language that a 15-year-old shouldn't be expected to process or respond to. How do you justify involving your child in adult political concepts that essentially require her to choose sides in your marital disputes?" Rebecca's response was a disaster that sealed her fate in the custody battle. Instead of acknowledging that she might have made mistakes, she doubled down on her ideology and actually began lecturing Judge Hendricks about internalized misogyny in the legal system. "Your Honor, with all due respect, your question demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking that perpetuates patriarchal family structures. Women are conditioned to prioritize men's comfort over children's need to develop critical consciousness about gender oppression. My daughter deserves to understand how traditional family dynamics have shaped her perceptions and limited her potential for authentic self-expression." Judge Hendricks' expression shifted from professional skepticism to barely contained disbelief. "Mrs. Morrison, are you suggesting that this court's concern for your child's emotional well-being represents internalized misogyny?" "I'm suggesting that the legal system's emphasis on maintaining father-child relationships regardless of the father's role in perpetuating patriarchal values shows how deeply our institutions are influenced by male-centered perspectives that prioritize men's rights over women's and children's liberation." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret later told me she'd never seen a parent so effectively destroy their own custody case in a single response. Judge Hendricks spent several minutes reviewing the evidence before delivering her decision, which was more favorable to me than I had dared to hope. Rebecca would receive minimal alimony due to her voluntary unemployment and demonstrated inability to maintain stable employment relationships. The house would be sold with proceeds divided according to our actual financial contributions, which heavily favored me since Rebecca had been unemployed for the final 8 months of our marriage. Most importantly, I was awarded primary custody of Emma, with Rebecca receiving only supervised visitation until she could demonstrate that she'd addressed the parental alienation behaviors documented in the court record. The court is particularly concerned, Judge Hendricks stated, about Mrs. Morrison's attempts to involve the minor child in ideological disputes that are inappropriate for a teenager and appear designed to damage the child's relationship with her father. Until Mrs. Morrison can demonstrate that she understands the harmful nature of these communications and has taken steps to address this behavior, visitation will be supervised by a court-appointed monitor. Rebecca's final courtroom outburst came when she accused Judge Hendricks of perpetuating judicial misogyny by failing to recognize that my psychological abuse had driven her to extreme responses that were actually forms of self-defense against patriarchal oppression. The judge's response was swift and final. Mrs. Morrison, your inability to take responsibility for your own actions and your continued attempts to blame others for the consequences of your choices demonstrate exactly why this court has concerns about your fitness as a parent. This hearing is adjourned. Walking out of that courtroom with primary custody of Emma, minimal financial obligations to Rebecca, and legal validation that her behavior had been harmful to our family felt like emerging from a nightmare that had lasted over a year. Margaret shook my hand and said, "I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen someone more effectively destroy their own case through sheer ideological stubbornness." 1 year after the Christmas party disaster, I barely recognized my life in the best possible way. The promotion to senior software architect had led to a team leadership role managing the development of financial analysis software for mid-sized investment firms, work that challenged me intellectually while providing the stability and income that Rebecca had once dismissed as capitalist exploitation. My new apartment had evolved into a real home where Emma and I had built routines around her homework, my work projects, and the kind of easy companionship that comes from mutual respect rather than ideological manipulation. Emma was thriving in ways that made the difficult transition worth every moment of legal stress and emotional upheaval. Her grades had improved dramatically once she was free from her mother's constant psychological analysis, and she joined the debate team where her natural intelligence could flourish without being filtered through feminist theory about performing for male authority figures. She'd also started dating a nice kid named Marcus Chin from her AP chemistry class, a relationship that developed naturally without Rebecca's toxic commentary about seeking male validation or internalizing patriarchal relationship models. The supervised visits with Rebecca had been reduced to twice monthly after several incidents where Rebecca had used the court-appointed monitor sessions to continue lecturing Emma about patriarchal oppression rather than simply spending time with her daughter. Emma had finally asked the family court to suspend visitation entirely until Rebecca completed anger management counseling and parental alienation therapy, a request that Judge Hendricks granted after reviewing reports from the supervision monitors about Rebecca's inability to have normal conversations without political indoctrination attempts. "Dad, I feel bad that Mom's so miserable," Emma told me one evening while we cooked dinner together, "but I can't keep pretending that her behavior is normal or healthy just because she calls it feminism. She needs professional help, not more workshops about how everyone in her life is oppressing her." Emma's emotional maturity and clear thinking at 16 impressed me daily, especially knowing how much psychological pressure Rebecca had put on her during those 8 months of radical transformation. The fact that Emma could feel genuine concern for her mother while maintaining healthy boundaries showed a level of wisdom that many adults never develop. My own social life had gradually rebuilt around colleagues who respected professional boundaries and neighbors who appreciated normal conversation without political lectures. I'd even started dating Amanda Walsh, a software project manager from a different company who shared my interests in technology, hiking, and the kind of quiet weekend activities that Rebecca had dismissed as boring before her consciousness was raised. Amanda was intelligent, financially independent, and had her own opinions about politics and social issues without needing to turn every interaction into an ideological battleground. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on genuine compatibility rather than the intense chemistry that had initially attracted me to Rebecca 15 years earlier. "I like how peaceful everything feels with you," Amanda told me during one of our weekend trips to Lake Tahoe. "There's no drama, no hidden agendas, just two adults enjoying each other's company and building something together." The contrast with Rebecca's constant need for conflict and validation was stark and refreshing. Meanwhile, Rebecca's life had continued its downward spiral in ways that would have been tragic if she hadn't brought it entirely upon herself through her own choices and behavior. She'd moved to a studio apartment across town after losing the house in our divorce settlement, a cramped space she couldn't afford without working part-time at an independent bookstore that specialized in feminist literature and radical political theory. Her social media presence had devolved into bitter posts about toxic masculinity, divorce court bias, and the patriarchal conspiracy that had cost her custody of her daughter and her comfortable lifestyle. The few remaining friends from her workshop days had gradually stopped engaging with her increasingly paranoid and self-pitying content. Her attempts to date had been unsuccessful, according to Emma, who occasionally heard updates through school friends whose parents knew Rebecca peripherally. Apparently, Rebecca's habit of analyzing every male interaction through the lens of oppression and power structures made normal romantic relationships impossible. Men who might have been interested in getting to know her were quickly driven away by lectures about emotional labor, financial equality, and the need to examine their privilege before deserving access to her time and attention. The irony was profound. In her quest to liberate herself from patriarchal relationship structures, Rebecca had become completely alone, isolated from the very connections that make life meaningful and fulfilling. Her ideology had promised empowerment but delivered loneliness, bitterness, and the kind of perpetual victimhood that prevents personal growth and genuine happiness. "I saw Mom at the grocery store last week," Emma mentioned during one of our Saturday morning breakfasts. "She looked really thin and tired, and she was buying one of those frozen dinners for one person. I felt sorry for her, but then I remembered how she used to make me feel guilty for loving you and wanting to spend time with our family." Emma paused, stirring her oatmeal thoughtfully. "I think she traded everything real for the approval of people who didn't actually care about her happiness." That observation captured the tragedy of Rebecca's transformation perfectly. She'd abandoned a loving marriage, damaged her relationship with her daughter, and alienated her extended family in pursuit of validation from radical feminists who disappeared the moment her situation became inconvenient for their cause. Dr. Winters and Janet Kozlov had moved on to recruiting new workshop participants, showing no concern for the wreckage they'd helped create in Rebecca's life. The community college had quietly ended the Women's Liberation Program after too many complaints from participants whose family relationships had been damaged by the toxic ideology being promoted under the guise of personal empowerment. Dr. Winters was now teaching basic composition to freshman students, her career as a radical educator effectively over thanks to the negative publicity generated by cases like Rebecca's. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Rebecca's radical transformation had actually been a gift that revealed her true character and priorities. The woman I'd married had always been capable of the selfishness and cruelty she displayed during those final 8 months. The feminist workshops had simply given her an ideological framework to justify behavior that was fundamentally about her own needs and desires rather than genuine concern for women's rights or social justice. A person who truly believed in equality and justice wouldn't try to alienate a child from her loving father, wouldn't verbally abuse elderly relatives for cooking family dinners, and wouldn't destroy a stable marriage because ideology promised something more exciting than commitment and partnership. Rebecca had used feminism as a weapon against the people who loved her, not as a tool for building a better world. Emma and I had created the family life that Rebecca claimed she wanted but had been unwilling to appreciate when she actually had it. Our home was built on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and the kind of daily kindness that makes ordinary moments feel meaningful. We supported each other's goals, celebrated each other's achievements, and handled disagreements like adults who cared about finding solutions rather than winning arguments. The peace and contentment I felt cooking dinner with my daughter, working on challenging projects with supportive colleagues, And building a healthy relationship with Amanda represented everything that Rebecca had thrown away in pursuit of an ideology that promised liberation but delivered only isolation and bitterness. Sometimes the most profound victory isn't getting revenge on someone who hurt you, it's building a life so fulfilling and genuine that their destructive behavior becomes irrelevant to your happiness. Rebecca had wanted to escape what she saw as patriarchal oppression, but what she'd actually escaped was love, family, and the ordinary contentment that comes from choosing to appreciate what you have rather than constantly searching for something to blame for your dissatisfaction. A year after our marriage ended in front of 43 witnesses at a Christmas party, I was finally free to be the father, partner, and man I'd always been, without having to justify my existence to someone who'd been convinced that my love was actually a form of oppression.